When I was 4 years old, just about to turn 5, my family moved to Britain. And it was in the aftermath of the election of Margaret Thatcher at a time when there was a rise in the skinhead movement all across Europe. And we had just gone to Heathrow Airport to pick up my grandmother, who was visiting for the first time from India. And we were all hungry on the way home, and we stopped at a McDonald's to eat. And we sat down. It was my sister, my mother, my grandmother, and I. And we sat down, and we were quickly accompanied at the next table by a group of skinhead men who started flicking French fries at us with the salt and the ketchup and all at our table, yelling at us to go home, Pakis, to go back to our country. And I remember this. It's a very vivid memory that has been etched into my mind, but I mostly remember feeling embarrassed and mortified. And I kept urging my mother, Mom, let's get out of here. We need to leave. Let's get out. And we finally left, and it really wasn't until years later when I kind of reflected on the humiliation that I felt that day and started to feel a sense of anger that I hadn't stood up or that my sister had not spoken out as people who could have maybe felt strong enough at that time, even though I was only 5. But it's this kind of memory that I think has animated so much of the work and the trouble that we feel today about what's going on. I proceeded to then become a real activist through high school and law school, where I went and attended court and juvenile court in Brooklyn, New York, and in Manhattan. And it was impossible at this time, it was the mid-'90s to the late '90s, to not feel shaken to the core about what I was seeing in every courtroom wherever I went, whether it was a summer internship in New Orleans, whether it was family court in Brooklyn. The sea of black and brown faces, as the United States, which has 5% of the world's population, was at that point had 25% of the world's prison population. I wanted to dedicate myself to criminal justice reform. And 13 and a half years later, after graduating from law school, after joining the Legal Defense Fund and fighting to exonerate people who had been wrongfully convicted of drugs in Tulia, Texas, then going to the American Civil Liberties Union and representing children who are in terrible, terrible conditions in immigration detention facilities in Texas, I then found myself on October 20th, 2014, standing in the office once occupied by J. Edgar Hoover, in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, as the leader of that division. A sweet irony, perhaps. Serving at the division was truly the honor of a lifetime. And I am proud of how aggressive we were at fighting for civil rights. I walked into the Civil Rights Division just weeks after Michael Brown had been shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. Weeks after people like DeRay, who you're going to hear from after, and legions of people were forcing the country to reckon with its long history of racial injustice in the criminal justice system and policing. And every week that I was on the job, it seemed, there was some video of brutal police violence that had gone viral. There was no question that relations between police and the community at that time were as tense as they ever had been, all over the country. And yet at the same time, there was finally a real and growing bipartisan consensus that our criminal justice system had failed too many Americans, particularly Americans of color, and that momentum for reform was finally on our side. From police reform in places like Cleveland, where the ADL played such a significant role and is playing such a significant role, to New Orleans, to Seattle, to Baltimore, to Chicago, to the work that we did on debtors' prisons, on bail reform, to access to counsel and courts, to sentencing, to juvenile justice, and the school-to-prison pipeline, to solitary confinement. The Civil Rights Division attempted to seize the moment for change. And in other areas too, from LGBTQ rights to disability rights to voting rights to hate crimes prosecutions and so on. The division worked hard to meet the very unique challenges and opportunities of our time. One of the most electrifying moments that I had during my almost 2.5 years on the job, was the day that the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, and I announced the complaint against the state of North Carolina to stop discrimination against transgender individuals. At that press conference, we stood, and I said to the cameras, let me reassure every transgender individual right here in America that you belong just as you are. You are supported. You are protected. We talked about how state-sanctioned discrimination never looks good in hindsight. It's not so very long ago that states, including North Carolina, had signs above restrooms and water fountains and on public accommodations, keeping people out based on a distinction without a difference. And our Attorney General, a daughter of North Carolina, whose father fought Jim Crow laws and who herself had fought real-time discrimination, racial bias, and the like, talked about how we should not act out of fear and misunderstanding, but out of values of inclusion and diversity and regard for all that make our country so great. She said that the Department of Justice wants you to know that we see you, that we stand with you, and that we will do everything we can to protect you going forward. Please know that history is on your side. And now here we are today, and some of this work is predictably getting undone for the time being. None of it can be erased. But within weeks of the new administration, the new Justice Department withdrew the transgender guidance that we had provided to school districts around the country at the request of school districts that were seeking that guidance. They changed longstanding positions, litigating positions that Texas had engaged in intentional race discrimination in the Justice Department's case against the Texas voter ID law. And an attorney general spoke out repeatedly and has been against police reform and against the consent decrees that have been so important to communities around the country, claiming with no evidence that they increase crime and lower police morale. But there's no question that a particularly painful day was 8 or 9 days in when the administration announced the Muslim ban or travel ban. And suddenly all of the divisive campaign rhetoric got very real. But you know, it's heartening. To me, what was so incredibly heartening and inspiring, and has been, was everyone who came out, who went to the airports, who sought to represent people who were stuck at airports, who protested in the streets. And in the weeks later, just recently, in the face of terrible acts of violence and hate around the country, we've seen Muslim leaders raise funds for vandalized synagogues and speak out forcefully against anti-Semitism. We've seen rabbis showing up at mosques to speak out against Islamophobia and against hate. There really is no question right now that these are incredibly challenging times for civil rights. And it seems like the world is in this epic battle between love and hate. And justice too often is the casualty. And yet so many of us, and I would say most of us, are choosing love every time. We know that the work that we do to close the gap between this country's lofty legal ideals and people's actual lived experience is never easy. It never has been, and it never will be. The march is always uphill, and the history of our country's progress has not been linear. I don't need to tell all of you that. Oftentimes, there are periods of significant progress that are followed by intense retrenchment. But the nation's progress also has not been inevitable. It has been the result of people like all of you in this room, people at ADL, people at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which I am going to be honored to be at the helm of on June 1st, people at organizations around the country that are pushing together, sometimes inside government, but many times outside, on the streets and in the courts and in the media. And it is often in times of the greatest challenge and crisis that we find our strongest voice, our solidarity, our power to fight hardest, because we will persist for what is right and not stop short of victory. We will persist for inclusion and for justice, because there is no question that history is on our side. So let's get to work. Thank you very much.